Any government, one that has set aside any notion of accountability to the people, any credible pretence of caring about the people in favour of serving the markets, banks and unelected, unaccountable transnational interests, can and surely will tell the people lies about things those people can neither see nor feel. They can lie to the people about a war in a land far away, a land most people would have struggled to point at on a map in the days before that war started. They can tell people the world's climate is changing and that it's all their fault on account of the cars they drive and the way they heat their homes and feed their families. They can tell those people a deadly new disease is loose in the world because of an unlikely knee trembler between a bat and an anteater in a Chinese wet market, and that millions of people will die unless they stay shut in their homes, stop earning money to pay their bills, isolate themselves from their lives and their loved ones, sacrifice their physical health and mental well-being and that of their children, and submit to multiple injections of an apparently brand new medical product. A medical product that will, just coincidentally of course, make billions of pounds, euros, dollars and yuan for a handful of other people who are already billionaires. A shameless and corrupt government can and surely will do all of that, tell lies like those, and with apparent impunity. Because after all, how can trusting people argue with any of it when the only images and information they receive about the war are provided by that government, when the proof the climate change is caused by their cars and gas boilers exists only in scientific papers published by scientists paid for by the government, when the danger posed by the new disease exists primarily in propaganda generated by the government, and the people have only the government to rely on for assurances regarding the safety and efficacy of the prescribed and all but mandated medical product. A government can and surely will, however, eventually get punch drunk on the success of so much nonsense pushed relentlessly by sock puppet politicians, biased scientific advisors, nudge units and complicit media. So punchy and carried away will the members of that government become that inevitably they cross a line and persuade each other they can tell lies about things those same benighted people see and feel every day, things that impact on their daily lives. It's at that point things get interesting. A government can tell people inflation is running at 8 or 9%, but even if they admit food prices are subject to other forces, people doing their weekly shop in the supermarket simply cannot help but see they're sometimes spending twice as much at the tills for the same stuff they always buy. I'll tell you something for nothing, and you can follow my thinking or not as you see fit, but I say we and much of the rest of Europe and the United States as well are already in recession. When the government says we're not in a recession, I say that's economy with actuality. What's one more lie, after all, when you're already up to your neck in them? Sometimes when you hurt yourself really badly, there are a few moments of feeling nothing at all while your body gathers up all the pain you're about to feel. I say that's where we are now, in that numb limbo, the last moments before we get hit by the hurt that will make many fall over. A government can tell people their energy bills are through the roof and en route to the stratosphere because the Russians blew up their own pipeline, the same pipeline that had delivered natural gas to Germany, Europe's powerhouse, a pipeline that had provided Russia with massive leverage when it came to dictating or at least influencing the nature of the relationship between Russia and the whole of Europe. A government can tell people Russia inflicted that wound upon itself when all it had to do to strangle Europe that way, if it so wished, was to turn off the tap while leaving its very expensive pipeline intact on the seabed, ready for another day. Governments can tell people as much, and the people may or may not believe it. Germany and Japan are already officially in recession. We are too, I say, but our government chooses to try and keep us looking the other way in the warm and bright summer months before the darkness of winter comes. But governments couldn't stop German people and others all over Europe feeling the cold and experiencing the darkness that results from that loss of all that energy their countries and industries had previously depended upon, like a baby relies on a mother's milk. People in Germany, that industrial and technological powerhouse, that most thrusting and dynamic of European economies, have been cutting down trees so they have wood to burn for heat, light and cooking next winter. Welcome back to the Middle Ages. Governments can cut off the blood supply to their economies if they wish and empower privately owned banks to create money out of thin air that only dilutes the value closer and closer to zero of the people's savings and pension funds, as well as the contents of their salaries. But they can't stop those people noticing the effect of impoverishment or of severed supply chains that might result in empty supermarket shelves. If governments think people will turn the same blind eyes and deaf ears to being subjected to cold and dirt and hunger, the same that they will turn to faraway wars, to questionable climate crises born only of computer modelling, and to illnesses that in reality kill almost only the morbidly sick and those well past the limit of natural life expectancy. If government don't realise they're playing with the kind of fire you might light if you have access to oil, gas and nuclear energy, but which in all likelihood is impossible if you're dependent on solar panels and wind turbines, if governments have been led by that old trickster hubris into thinking there's no limit to how outrageously they might lie to the people and still get away with it, then I say there's a storm coming. For this reason, governments seek to sever people from family, history, tradition and faith, all that might keep them anchored. If there is a moral high ground, then we are looking up at it from the darkness below. If there's a moral high ground, then we abandoned it long ago. Our government sanctions propaganda about how little boys might be persuaded they're little girls, and little girls might be persuaded they're little boys. Our government pays for the painting of rainbows on roads, while children have the colour carved and bled out of their possible futures. All around us now is the slow creep of erosion of the basics of decent and happy lives. I saw a headline last week about how in a year's time the repossessions of houses will start. King of the sock puppets Rishi Sunak had the bankers into Downing Street notionally to talk about mortgages, among other things. Interest rates are up again to 5%. That's nice of them, isn't it? Nice of the bankers, who, when the money runs out, just press buttons on computer keyboards to create more phony Ponzi billions, billions for faraway wars and to finance the profitable rebuilding of the country flattened by that war. Repossession of houses, one of the great dreads of modern life in our part of the world, is back on the cards. Apparently this is where we're headed now, while politicians score points about who ate birthday cake and drank wine while singing karaoke songs as elderly people died alone and loved ones were barred from their funerals. All over the country, people are growing scared of the future, fearful of how they'll feed their families and keep them warm in winter, keep roofs over their heads. It doesn't have to be this way. People feeling hopeless and powerless must remember that they already have all the power they will ever need if they will just come together as one and use that power. History helps us here. The history of the First World War. In Glasgow, when so many of the men were at war and women were left behind with the kids, there were no council houses then. All homes were owned by private landlords. You might say people had nothing, but all things considered, I'm not sure they were happy about that situation. In my experience, people with nothing are seldom happy. It was 1915 and husbands and fathers were away fighting the war, meaning many women were bringing up their children alone. The war effort was drawing people into the city to work in the factories, the foundries and shipyards, and they needed homes to live in. An already overcrowded city, one in which the city fathers had stubbornly ignored the state of the housing stock and failed to build anything like enough new ones, was pushed to breaking point. Profit-hungry landlords saw the opportunity and sought to hike the rents. Families that couldn't pay were evicted to make way for those that could. A Glasgow woman called Mary Barber organised a resistance movement, encouraging tenants to withhold their rent and coordinating protests outside any homes targeted for eviction. The bailiffs would find their way blocked by hundreds of women, many with prams filled with babies and children. The efforts of what became known as Mrs. Barber's Army attracted the attention of shipyard and factory workers who threatened to strike if the evictions weren't stopped. So effective was Mrs. Barber's rent strike, the Secretary of State for Scotland was forced to act, initiating the passing of a bill through Parliament that froze rents at pre-war levels. Some of the tenant protections set in place in 1915 were still in place up into the 1980s. Here's the thing. All of that was achieved by ordinary people coming together in defiance of injustice. Rather than stand mutely by while their neighbours were thrown out onto the street, ordinary people, in the main women with their babies in their arms, stood up for each other and said no. That was all it took, and a national government was forced to accede to their demands. So many of us are sickened by the diet of lies we've been fed, but I say the latest danger is the relentless nudge to forgive and forget, to put it all behind us. I, for one, have no stomach for such a betrayal, the very suggestion that we brush under the carpet so much hurt, so much damage, for which no one has yet accepted responsibility. Each of us must take responsibility for what happens next. The choice is obvious. March in line into an impoverished, limited future built on lies and shaped to empower and enrich the few, or make a stand with those who would defend the freedoms and way of life cherished by the many. All of that's my opinion, of course, and you're free to disagree with me. Keep your tweets and emails coming all through the show. You can email gbviews@gbnews.com, and you can tweet me as well at gbnews, and I'll try to get to some of your comments later in the show if precious time allows. Joining me tonight, the author, columnist and presenter, Tonya Buxton.